You may not know this, but on this very day, 200 years ago, someone else was ordained into the Unitarian ministry. Jared Sparks, a former carpenter and later a Harvard-educated minister, became the first pastor of the newly organized First Independent Church of Baltimore, serving from 1819 to 1823. It later became known as the First Unitarian Church of Baltimore, in the same historic building where it now stands. At Sparks' ordination on May 5th, 1819, Dr. William Ellery Channing of the Federal Street Church in Boston delivered his seminal treatise, Unitarian Christianity. Has anyone heard of this sermon, Unitarian Christianity? Some of you out there. Okay, Terry has. Be like Terry. After this, you can all be like Terry. You'll all have heard of it. This later became known as the Baltimore Sermon. Channing's sermon laid out innovative principles for the developing theology and philosophy of Unitarianism. By 1825, these principles led to the founding of the American Unitarian Association. The distinction between a Unitarian Christian and a Trinitarian Christian is perhaps best explained by the distinction UUs often make between the religion of Jesus, Unitarianism, and the religion about Jesus, the religion that centers on who Jesus was, Trinitarianism. To the extent that there is a Christian in me, it is decidedly the religion of Jesus. Channing insisted Jesus' humanness, I say Jesus' humanness, made him no more or less divine than any other human, filled with God's Spirit, as we all are, but what Jesus did with that holy blessing was greater than any other human on earth, according to Channing. Now, Channing's eloquence, his charisma, theological depth shook the foundations of the liberal anti-Trinitarians of the time up in Boston and caused them each to wrestle with Unitarianism or just succumb to its incisive call to the divine goodness of people, the endless possibilities of human progress. This was a significant moment for Unitarianism and for Congregationalism in the northeastern United States at this time, which were still in formation, a formation that aligned with the early days of the American civic experiment and aligned with manifest destiny and a slave-based economy. See, the history of our Unitarian faith is theologically linked to these innovations of human progress. And as a denomination, we are now in the process of reckoning with our beginnings and with the tendencies of our early heroes such as Channing and even Theodore Parker, who brought their intellectual prowess to preach abolition, but did very little to overturn the slavery economy or to assist in actually freeing slaves. In fact, in his book, Slavery, Channing states that he approves of the abolitionists' cause, but he feels they have done wrong. He writes, "They have fallen into the common error of enthusiasts, that of taking too narrow views, of feeling as if no evil existed but that which they opposed, and as if no guilt could be compared with that of countenancing it or upholding it." He condemns the abolitionists even further by arguing another objection to their movement is that they have sought to accomplish their objects by a system of agitation. That is, by a system of affiliated societies, gathered and held together and extended by passionate eloquence. Truth can hardly be heard unless shouted by a crowd. This is what Channing said. In this, it is clear Channing did not agree with the more boisterous nature of the abolitionist movement, the passion, the incisiveness. Now, I've heard many UUs today give a similar critique of the Black Lives Matter movement and of Black lives of Unitarian Universalism. This critique is not new. It's not new for Unitarians. These ideas are 200 years old. See, Channing would rather have seen gradual emancipation through education and personal transformations than through movements that directly confronted chattel slavery. He wrote, One of the errors of the abolitionists has been the adoption of immediate emancipation as their motto. It is clear that Channing did not see Africans as equal to whites, but he also abstained from fully supporting abolitionism because it offended his tendency to want to ponder the good. And too many abolitionists were fiercely enthusiastic. They were impatient. They supported immediate emancipation. Channing remained aloof in his intellectual exploration of slavery. Immediate emancipation was wrong to him because ultimately he believed Africans were incapable of immediate self-governance. And those who felt passionately about the abolitionist cause offended his sensibilities of how to oppose an unjust institution politely. Channing's tendency to want to retain the social order and his romantic racism, I say romantic racism, allowed him to take a very minimal role in the slavery debate, but still be considered a hero. Approximately the last 12 years of his life did contribute to the cause of abolitionism. However, this was largely through writings and sermons only. It is clear, therefore, that Channing's efforts were minimal in the fight for freedom and equality for African people, African Americans. His prejudices, his assumptions, and his lack of vision, well, they are a warning to all Unitarian Universalists in today's age. Now, modern Universalist theologian Reverend Rebecca Parker notes that theology can bless our ignorance. It can also disconnect us from seeing reality, and it can stand in the way of our doing justice. If our theology focuses only on humanity's progress, only on the essential goodness of people, well, we may gloss over the evil we are capable of committing. But she also notes theology can open our eyes. She draws from William Ellery Channing's theology of the wonderful array of human power as a reflection of our creation in God's image. Our whole being is divine, and unfolding our powers is our reason for being. Channing came to realize the social implications of that theology, that anything that gets in the way of that unfolding is a way of killing God. Slavery, Channing came to understand, was an evil because it kept slaves from coming into the fullness of divine living. You see, Channing, like all of us, like any of us, was neither good nor bad. He contained multitudes, hypocrisies. He contained beautifully expressed aspirations, adherence to a dehumanizing status quo. All of those things in one Unitarian minister. As UU's Rebecca Parker notes, we value those who stand against their culture with open eyes, people who see more clearly and who dare to say what they see. But she also points out Channing's congregation had rejected his analysis of slavery. And she asks this question: what would have transformed Channing's congregation? What the collective community knows and recognizes is important because people learn in community. They are supported by community to take action. Rebecca Parker shares a powerful story about a congregation, a UU congregation on the West Coast in World War II, who was faced with the government's intended internment of a Japanese family and the seizure of that family's farm during World War II. The leaders of the congregation offered to buy the farm for $1, preserve it, and maintain it until the family was released, and then sell it back to them for that same dollar. This saved the family's farm, illustrating that when a community knows and acts and keeps faith, it can disrupt the power of ignorance and silence to destroy. It can disrupt destruction of lives. Knowledge, Parker says, allows us to disrupt injustice. To know is to love. And yet, knowledge of systemic racism, well, it's just not enough. It's not enough. Are you with me? I could stand here. I could give you more statistics that would plunge you into devastation about the number of Black people and Latinx people living under the poverty line today and how that number has not changed farther than 1 percentage point in the last 4 decades in America. I could tell you about how home and land ownership remains more elusive to Black and brown people than ever. You may gasp as you are in shock, in dismay, and shake your head and wonder what you could possibly do to disrupt an economy whose skeletal structure was built on chattel enslavement of Black people from Africa and genocide and stolen land from indigenous brown people in America. Knowledge alone is not justice. I said knowledge alone is not justice. This has been a big week for theologians. April 28th was the 1-year anniversary of Reverend Dr. James Cone's death. He was the father of Black liberation theology and my first professor of systematic theology. He changed my life forever, and he did love his students using knowledge, passion, and righteous anger, saying there is no justice without memory. Cone suggests that silence is racism's best friend. James Cone said, most whites don't like to talk about racism because it makes them feel guilty, a truly uncomfortable feeling. By the way, he said this at a Unitarian Universalist General Assembly in the year 2000, so he said it to us. But how uncomfortable does racism make its victims? He asks. When oppressive history is hidden, the victims are made the oppressors, and the oppressors the victims. No one can be neutral or silent in the face of this great evil, James Cone told UUs. We are either for it or against it. In the year 2000 at General Assembly, Cone challenged the UUs to develop an enduring race critique embedded in our faith, and to make the analysis so explicit that no one can avoid talking about it. 19 years later, we are getting a little closer to having an essential racial analysis that is part of our theology, our central theology. Soon at General Assembly, we will vote on the adoption of an 8th principle, which, like all of our UU principles, is a mouthful and will not fit on a bumper sticker. The 8th principle is, we, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions. So what does this actually look like in our daily lives? I mean, which starfish do we pick up and save? Some of you may know this, but we have a resident living at 2650 North Druid Hills Road, the property we've purchased. He's been there for a long time, since before we bought the property. Now remember, we don't live there yet. We own a lot of usable land and a building at a time when over 300 people are homeless on any given night in DeKalb County, and over 3,000 people are homeless on any given night in the city of Atlanta. Now, we may not be able to house all 3,000 right now. And if you are thinking, well, that property is ours, let's call the police and get them out of there, then I would like to invite you to join the moral imagination that will help us endure this time we are living in. Right now, congregations across the country are housing immigrants in sanctuary, people who are in grave danger of being deported. The amount of resources, of money, time, and effort that a congregation makes to house but one person is astronomical. You can ask my dad. He's actually involved in this in one congregation in Maryland. We are not in a position yet to be a sanctuary congregation for someone. But we also do not have to call the police on this resident, on our guest. We can build a relationship with him. But don't just, I will get to the specifics of that. We can build a relationship with him. And we can find out what he needs, and we can find a way to meet those needs with the incredible resources of this community in an organized way. So we're going to have a plan. I just realized that doesn't mean we're all going to go over there and start talking to him, bothering him. And we can do even more than that. Are you with me? Do you remember a few weeks ago, I told you the story about how in the formation of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2014, my seminary took over a classroom in New York City and made it a hub for pain, for ideas, for support, for activism. Now, I told you that story of the hub for a reason. UUCA can become a hub, healing the wound of poverty in Atlanta. Now, it won't happen overnight, but I believe we can be the hub our community so desperately needs. Are you with me? Yes. Can we be the hub healing that wound of poverty in Atlanta, for Atlanta? Now, this has been a big week for theologians, I said. Yesterday, the world lost an exceptional light and child of God. The theologian Rachel Held Evans, a young, brave Christian woman of valor who challenged the hypocrisies of literal biblical interpretation and evangelical theology from within evangelicalism. Well, she succumbed to complications after fighting off a brief but serious infection and left her 2 babies behind. Rachel had something to say to us about how we might confront poverty in Atlanta. What I love about the ministry of Jesus, Rachel wrote, is that he identified the poor as blessed and the rich as needy, and then he went and ministered to them both. This, I think, is the difference between charity and justice. Justice means moving beyond the dichotomy between those who need and those who supply, and confronting the frightening and beautiful reality that we desperately need one another. Desperately need each other. So we can bless Channing and his fervor for us to be the religion of Jesus and not the religion about Jesus. And so we must take on a rigorous and enthusiastic, enlivening moral theology. We can't succumb to those who bought and sell Christianity for political gain, nor can we yield the moral high ground because we're angry with them. Deep religious and moral values have been the backbone of every great progressive movement. Prophetic imagination must come before we see political implementation. I said prophetic imagination must come before we see political implementation. If you find yourself, like we do at my house sometimes, falling into a depressive, anxious slumber after an evening of shock and horror at the day's news, well, that is a blessing, my friends. If you have noticed yourself talking with your more conservative neighbors while hiding from your more conservative family members, well, that is a blessing. If you work for an invigorating, life-changing protest at the state capitol only to return the next day to feelings of confusion, isolation, and overwhelm, well, that too is a blessing. If you feel uncomfortable in the places where you used to feel comfortable, that too is a blessing. It's a blessing because you are becoming, as Dr. Martin Luther King would say, creatively maladjusted to daily life in America, and it does not feel good. The moment has arrived to decide what we are going to do with our creativity and our maladjustment. Which starfish will you pick up and release into the ocean with your own 2 hands? Mistakes will be made. You will miss the mark. You will wrestle with your discomfort. Let us, your congregation, love you through that. Let Goddess love you through it. Let Spirit love you through it. But let us love you through that. What we are all going through are what Reverend William Barber calls the birthing pains of the Third Reconstruction. See, this is all part of a political plan dating back 50 years. It's all part of the Southern strategy where we are today. And so it's time for a third reconstruction. Now, Kay Johnson will be happy to know that we have midwives to get us through these birthing pains of the third reconstruction. Prophets walk among us, even now. And we remember our second UU source tells us to look to the prophets, to the words and deeds of prophetic people who challenge us to confront powers and structures of evil with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love. I know Alan Lee knows that second source. We taught that class together. Reverend William Barber challenges us to confront powers and structures of evil with justice and compassion. So he is a prophet among us. He asks us to work with all of our might on this issue of voter suppression, particularly in the South. See, he sees these connections, connecting the continued trends of racism and poverty back to increased disenfranchisement in our region, in Georgia. He's traveling all across the United States, reviving Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign. And Unitarian Universalists are meeting him and joining the effort in almost every city and every state in our country. Perhaps you are waiting. You're waiting for things to calm down. Perhaps you're waiting to get through school. Or you're waiting for your kids to finish school. Or you're just wanting to get through another phase of life. Friends, we cannot afford to wait. We desperately need each other. Let us be the people Channing called us to be in his fiery sermon preached 200 years ago today in Baltimore. I will close by reading the Channing's charge to the newly ordained minister, Channing, who contained multitudes, who was not good nor bad, spectacular, challenged. I will close by reading his charge to the newly ordained minister, Jared Sparks, in his Baltimore sermon. If any light can pierce and scatter the clouds of prejudice, it is that of pure example. My brother, may your life preach more loudly than your lips. Be to this people a pattern of all good works, and may your instructions derive authority from the well-grounded belief in your hearers, that you speak from the heart, that you preach from experience, that the truth which you dispense has wrought powerfully in your own heart, that God and Jesus and heaven are not merely words on your lips, but most affecting realities to your mind and springs of hope and consolation and strength in your trials. Thus laboring, may you reap abundantly and have a testimony of your faithfulness, not only in your own conscience, but in the esteem, love, virtues, and improvements of your people. Amen. Blessed be.